Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. I'm super excited today to have a friend of mine, a film school professor on the show, Matt Scott. Matt is a professor at the University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts, where he teaches IMAX filmmaking. He's got an extensive background in television as a producer, writer, and post-production supervisor, and is a member of the Producers Guild of America. Matt, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Where are you now? Death Valley?
Yeah, that's my background. I'm actually in Los Angeles this morning, but the room I'm in is quite messy, so we're on virtual background today.
We got the virtual background. That's awesome. Well, so you and I met a few years ago
Hmm.
out at USC. When I was in space, I had a chance to help work on the IMAX film, A Beautiful Planet. And I think I was doing a tour, met with the dean. What an amazing school, by the way. It's a gorgeous campus. I wish I was going to college again at USC. And she kind of put us in touch because you have an interest in that background, also that field.
Hmm. Yeah. So yeah, we met, goodness, 5, 6 years ago now. It's been a little
Yeah.
while.
Hmm.
And it was actually the first year I was teaching, which just happened to be incredibly convenient because so much of the history of IMAX is space films. And that is
Right.
such a large component of the whole circuit of all these institutional theaters. Space films do really well. They really go to the mission of the theaters that are playing them.
Right.
And it's been a huge part of IMAX for many, many years. And you are part of a very long line of astronauts that have been trained to shoot IMAX in space by the great James Nyhouse, who's still part of IMAX's space team to this day.
Yeah. Yeah. James was our director of photography on A Beautiful Planet and probably 5 or 6 or 7 other movies
Hmm.
that Tony Myers directed too. Tony was awesome. She was my director and um, based in Toronto. And unfortunately, she passed away last year from cancer, but she was amazing. She kind of
Oh
mentored
yeah.
me into this new career I'm going in.
Yeah, no, she was fantastic. I'm really grateful that, I was able to get her to come out and speak to my class
Oh, wow.
once with James,
Yeah.
before she retired. So that
Right.
was wonderful. So that was actually right around the time that Beautiful Planet was coming out. So she
Right.
and James were in town, and I gave both of them a nice tour of the school, and they were kind enough to do a screening, and then they spoke both before and after the film, which was wonderful.
Yeah, they're awesome. So when you tour the University of Southern California, first of all, it's this gorgeous campus. It's in a downtown LA. It's near the Science Museum. There's some cool things
Mhm.
right around it. And when you go to the film school, which, the USC Film School is pretty well known. I think it's the understatement of the century. Um,
Yeah, I mean, we
it's,
joke we have our own mafia in Hollywood, which is partially true.
yeah. So, I mean, in terms of film schools, it's USC is definitely one of the film schools. So the buildings that you have there are kind of ridiculous. I remember walking in, I think where we do the IMAX class, what, once a year I come out and am a guest lecturer in your class.
You are, yes.
Um, is it like the Robert Zemeckis building? And I
Yes.
remember seeing the Steven Spielberg,
And the George Lucas building, yeah.
the George
So,
Lucas. Yeah.
yeah, so we're on version 3.0 of the film school. I mean, the original USC Film School started off in the former horse stables going back in the day. Um, uh, Interestingly enough, the film school was founded basically over a fencing, practice between the president of the university and Errol Flynn back in 1929, I think before the crash, and eventually moved into the horse stables. And then George Lucas actually contributed quite a bit to building up the Film School 2.0, which I went to when I was an undergrad in the 90s. And then he came back around 2008 and decided, no, we need to rebuild this and expand. And now we have version 3.0, which is what you've seen.
Yeah, it's an amazing school. But just seeing the names on the buildings, that's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, we like to name things after people out there. It's I mean, when you walk around, you've only gotten a little touch of what we have.
Right.
I mean, Lucas, Spielberg, Zemeckis all have like full buildings named after them. But then, like, we have the Summer Redstone stage, we have the Akira Kurosawa stage, and then I think we're up to 28, 30 endowed chairs now. And when I started, there were about two. So the dean in her 25 plus years at the school have she's gotten a lot of fundraising I think at least one year she actually brought in more money to the university than the football team, and that's saying something because the USC football
Wow.
obviously brings in a lot of money.
Wow. So if I want to have the Terry Virts building, what's that? What do I need to do?
Um, I that would be quite a bit of money. George Lucas very publicly donated, I think it was 175 million for his building.
Oh
So
man.
it's going to be a little bit of cash. But you can also get a room. I mean, there's still quite a few classrooms and other facilities within the building that you can put your name on as well.
Can I get like a chair or maybe a trash can? We need to have the Terry Virts trash can.
You know what they actually have run
Chip
out
in a
of,
hundred
and
bucks.
no, trash cans way more than $100. An outdoor
Oh man.
picnic bench starts at 5,000.
Oh my
Um,
God.
and and by the way, I want you to know this is 100% true. USC is running low on inventory and may have run out of urinals to endow, and it's become kind of a joke for those of us who only have so much money to donate. But I think it's about 3 grand. You can actually have an endowed urinal. And I'm not kidding. Like you go
That
in
is
and like there are
unbelievable.
plaques over the urinals. It's like,
Mm.
and normally they're sponsored by, not George Lucas, of course, but normally they're sponsored by somebody who can give more in like the 3,000 range. But you get a little plaque over there and you get to put something really funny. It's like, this is brought to you by the writer of Problem Child, or something like
Right.
that, which is hilarious. And
That's awesome.
frankly, if I was going to endow something, that's probably what I would do, because that's just absolutely hilarious. And I would totally do that.
The urinal, you could write like well endowed by the chair of whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, and the crazy thing is, whenever you endow something, you get like a little party for it, depending on the size of your endowment. I
Right.
mean, if you're endowing a chair, that's like 5 million, I think. So there's like a whole ceremony that goes with it,
Oh
and like
yeah.
the provost comes and all that. There's a reception. But for a urinal, they actually have like a little mini party for you in the men's room. And they like take the sink and they like sanitize the room to like the nth degree. But they go through and they like put out like a cheese and cracker plate, and they have some wine, and there's like a fruit plate, and it's hilarious because that when I was working there full time, uh, the restroom that was like just down the hall from me had one of those ceremonies, and it was lovely and it was pretty and also hilarious at the same time, because it's hard not to recognize the fact that we're having this party to celebrate the endowment of a urinal.
My God, that's amazing. All right, so you and I worked on a film last year, really 2 years ago. God, One More Orbit, which was
Yeah.
amazing. For me, it was the first film I directed. I fell in love with directing after doing that, and you helped us organize it, and you helped me write it. You're one of the
Mhm.
writers on. You wrote the film, the script. So
Yes.
um, we'll have to take the proceeds from that documentary and maybe endow a urinal at the USC Film School. That is so funny. Well, so I want to talk about that, but I want to talk about the Oscars. We just had the Oscars,
Yes.
and to prepare for this thing, we were talking, and you said watch Nomadland. So I watched Nomadland last night, and it's amazing. The film that Chloe Zhao made is amazing. It's
Mhm.
really to just do that with normal people. The footage is beautiful, but like it's not the feel good movie of the summer.
No.
And this whole Oscar season was just like, wow. I I just couldn't get into it. I miss Indiana Jones. I miss Ford versus Ferrari. I miss
Mhm.
Jason Bourne. I miss like fun, cool movies. And this year it just seemed like it's like this, I don't know, very preachy, very
Yeah.
not there was not the feel good movie of the summer anywhere to be seen that I could see anyway.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to think about the economics as to why that happened. I mean, this year, a lot of films that got released were never really expected to do, a huge amount of box office either. So,
Right.
you had all of these amazing giant tentpole films which are done and in the can that just didn't get released because,
Yeah. There's no
studios
box
don't want
office.
to. Yeah, they
Right.
don't want to lose their huge box office window. I mean, and a few did come out. Like Hamilton doesn't sound like a huge box office film, but that whole play had so much heat behind it that I think it would have had a really successful run in theaters. But releasing it for the 4th of July also was a great way to promote Disney Plus. So I understand. Then again, I also understand why Black Widow has been held back, even though there's a huge, huge demand of people that want to see it. but
Right.
holding it back for a theatrical window
Yeah.
makes sense because you're going to make a lot of money when we do get to go back to the theater.
Yeah. You can go back to theaters now. I just saw,
Mhm.
I heard a podcast yesterday about a film. I forgot the name of it. It's about a kid who gets paralyzed in high school. Anyway, it sounded like a really cool film, and I'm going to go see it. It's like an inspirational kind of thing. It's out in theaters right now, but I'm definitely going to go see James Bond. I'm going to go see Top Gun. Those are theater,
Yep.
movies, and I understand that they had to delay it. And
Yeah.
but it just seemed like the vibe nowadays is really moving towards TV series away from
Yeah.
movies, right? Is that
Yeah. I mean, right now, honestly, all of the really cutting edge, really what I would say really interesting storytelling is on cable or on streaming. And
right?
a lot of that comes down to I know it's going to sound strange, but sort of censorship issues because when you're going through like broadcast TV, you've got, standards and practices and, there are some federal guidelines you have to follow. And
Right.
then when you're in the theater, you generally have the MPAA guidelines you have to, adhere to. So while not the only reason, it definitely kind of restricts what content you put out there. So now when
Right.
you're doing especially a theatrical release, studios have been aiming for tent poles, these giant, films like a Marvel film where, yes, it's a big investment, but it's also going to have a huge return. And you really want to pack, 3,000-4,000 theaters for like a weekend or two, make all your
Right.
money and then, move it on to the next platform. And that really has squeezed out a lot of films that, traditionally would have been in theaters because there really wasn't another release method for them. So all of the cool things we saw over the years, the Rosemary's Baby, the Chinatown, those films would be, a lot harder to be financially successful in theaters these days unless they're made on a very small budget.
Right. The budget is key. Not to name drop, but I was talking with Jim Cameron last year about his Avatar movies, and he told me that if he made $1 billion, it might
Mm-hmm.
be a failure. If the box office were $1 billion, it would probably be considered a failure just because
Yeah.
there's well, first of all, the studio doesn't get all that money, right? If you get $100 million in box office, the studio doesn't get that. That they only get half that or roughly. And then there's other things in there. And anyway, the economics of it were really interesting. How much money has to come
Mm-hmm.
in order for
Yeah.
it to be profitable.
Yeah, and this is honestly one problem that comes in with, most, if not all of the studios being, basically a public entity is that not only do you, have to maintain, cash flow and you have a structure, but you also have reporting and forecasting that you're up against also. So
Right.
you have to take a guess at what your earnings are going to be, and then your goal is to at least meet them or, exceed them.
Right.
And then not by too much, because if you go over, then that can cause some other issues as well.
Right.
um, so you have these problems that are frankly just Wall Street problems that don't have anything to do with the creative that goes into the film.
Right.
And it's problematic to a point where you're like, okay, that's it always seems disingenuous to me to make a great film that does have a huge and wonderful box office and it's considered a failure because it like missed by like a quarter of a percentage point on their returns for the week.
Yeah.
And I mean, who knows what could have happened? There could have been a hurricane in the south, a whole bunch of theaters could be closed, some major news event could happen and people stay home. A pandemic breaks out. We don't know anything about that this year. So there are all these like external factors that can really affect a film and cause it to be a failure. And they're successful, wonderful made pieces of cinema, and they're just not necessarily going to hit Wall Street expectations, and that becomes a problem.
Right. So speaking of all these different films, and as a film school professor, you guys have, I'm sure the students watch movies. What a cool major to major in film.
Mm-hmm.
You just get to sit around and watch movies all day.
Oh yeah, and my class is like one of the best ones because not only am I teaching, a specialized version of filmmaking, I'm also teaching a really feel good version of it too. Because, with IMAX, I'm teaching basically like large proto animals and spacemen. So
Right.
it's like the greatest third grade class ever, except it's for college.
Yeah, but
So yeah,
those kids are smart. It's hard to get into the USC Film School. I don't know
it
what the
is
acceptance rate is. It's not
lower than
100%.
Harvard.
Yeah, it's harder than Harvard to get in the USC Film
Mm-hmm.
School. And these kids come out of high school with like a portfolio, right? I mean, they have
Some
done
of
the
them,
work.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
some of them. I mean,
yeah.
it's interesting because USC is, they what it takes to get in now is ridiculous. I'm teaching there, and I don't know that I could get in. I
Yeah,
mean,
and
that's
you went there in the 90s.
yes, I did. I
Yeah.
don't know that I could get in now because the competition is just so ridiculous.
It's crazy. There's no way. I went to the Air Force Academy. There's no way I would get into the Air Force Academy nowadays. I would have been like, nope, you're not going there. So I want to talk about some of the movies, the modern day movies, which are, the ones that I love. But
Mm-hmm.
you gave me a list of films to watch. And so I'm trying to watch some like historical films,
Mm-hmm.
just as I'm trying to learn because I want to do this, professionally.
Mm-hmm.
um, Metropolis was a really interesting movie that
Yes.
my crewmate, Samantha Cristoforetti, she was like a rookie. So I said, all right, Samantha, make our poster. Every mission has to have a poster. So she made our Expedition 43 poster out of the Metropolis robot.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so interesting to see how they made this kind of epic movie 100 years ago. It's German,
Yeah. Yeah.
Fritz Lang. And it's so cool to watch these old, it's really, kind of dystopian and all
Mm-hmm.
these it's like a modern day there was all those teenage uh dystopian movies a few years ago. It's kind of like that 100 years ago. But
Yeah.
you guys study that? You study the
Oh, of
100
course.
years ago? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, throughout the process of going to film school, part of it is just giving you an education of, okay, what do people already know? What have people already done? And so a lot of that is, watching films, discussing films. That's,
Right.
kind of like the bread and butter of film school is like, okay, what has everybody else done? What can we learn from it? And, that comes right down to my class. I mean, I'm teaching a very niche form of filmmaking, which is IMAX filmmaking. There are only so many IMAX filmmakers in the world, and that
Right.
number is exceedingly low. There are probably more YouTubers on my block than there are filmmakers at this IMAX filmmakers.
Right.
And so I'm teaching something super niche, but it's still the same thing. It's like, okay, what have people done before? What's worked?
Right.
And I'm lucky in that I get to challenge my students to be like, okay, this is everything that we know. Now, for your little projects, go out and try and break those rules. And I'm trying to get them ready so that they can, push the envelope a bit, because for years, IMAX was just so expensive to work with. And
Yeah.
it still is in film, but now that we're shooting digital, they have a lot more opportunities. And,
Right.
I've my classroom is an IMAX theater, so I
Yeah.
can get their
It's
films,
amazing.
yeah, up on that screen, and they can really like test it and look at it. And because it is digital, we can have a lot more play with it, and they can like learn and make changes, and they actually get to come in and use the theater on their own while they're in the process.
Wow.
And it made a huge difference because they get to look at it and be like, oh, that's not right, I need to go redo this. And you
Yeah.
know back when you were shooting on film, I mean, there was very famously, there was a film called Shackleton where they loaded up the ship in Port Hunami, sailed down to, sailed down to Antarctica, filmed the whole thing, came back. And that's when they got to process the film. So they just
Oh,
hoped that the camera was working the whole time.
right.
Like if the sprockets had been off and the film had been getting like, hurt, they wouldn't have known. They would have shot the entire film before they could have processed one roll.
Right.
And now we started doing 3D dailies in the field back in 2010. So
Mhm.
it's been a great evolution.
So a daily, I learned this, is you shoot and then they quick process it, and then the director and whoever goes and watches that, they can see what got filmed.
Mm-hmm.
So the way we did dailies on A Beautiful Planet, this was pretty cool. In the past, they'd always flown these giant film cameras on the space
Mm-hmm.
shuttle or whatever. And you can't do that anymore because basically there's not enough room in the Soyuz to fly this stuff. So that
Mm-hmm.
was the first ever digital IMAX space movie. And we saved it on these big hard drives that did get shipped back to Earth, but we had a
Mm-hmm.
little like thumbnail video on a little CF card, so we could download the thumbnail video. And Tony and James and Marsha Ivins, one of our astronauts, they'd all watch it, and then a couple days later they'd say, "Hey Terry, that was a good shot, but open up the aperture or film it from a
Mm-hmm.
different angle or whatever."
Yeah.
So we actually could do quote unquote dailies from space, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
It was like, it
Yeah.
was more like weekly. By the time we downloaded it and got back, it was about a week.
Yeah. Well,
But
you
it's
know what
better
they're
than
called?
waiting 3 months to ship a bunch of film and then see if it worked, and then you're not
Oh
going to get
yeah.
another. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the ability to like make those changes while we're in the field. I mean, I was on a project in Madagascar for 5 months, 5.5 months.
Wow.
And because we were able to go and process things not in real time, but pretty close back in 2012, we could make decisions. I was actually the DIT on that project, and I was processing the footage. And we had one morning where we did a balloon shot, and something had gone wrong, and somebody had bumped the focus, and we're talking like just like it was a millimeter off on the lens. It was like tiny, but in IMAX that tiny is magnified, and it's an incredibly unforgiving medium.
Yeah,
So you
it
know
is.
I was able to go in and be like, oh, that's soft, because it was a gorgeous shot too. It was
Uh,
like it's terrible to lose. It was this beautiful dawn shot. They came
right.
across this ancient baobab, and mind you, in a hot air balloon, so it's quiet and they're not scaring the lemurs. And they got this beautiful, beautiful shot. And then it was soft. We were like, ugh. But knowing that the shot was soft right then and there, I could take that to the producer and be like, okay, the shot was soft. And we were supposed to move that day. So the question is, do we stay one more day and try it again, or do we move on? So it's actually very empowering to the producer, because if he makes the or she makes the decision right then and there, you can actually save a bit of money, because once you move, coming back is way more
Right.
expensive than staying.
Than just staying an extra day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that Tony did for us before we launched, we had this training, and she's like, make yourself an IMAX movie. So we had to like film ourselves in the simulator, and
Mhm.
Samantha and I came up with some goofy script, and then she processed it, and then we went
Mhm.
down to the local IMAX theater in Galveston, and
Mhm.
we sat there and got some popcorn and watched our movie. And if the camera moves just a little bit, you're getting sick in the IMAX theater. And if
Mhm.
it's like you said, if it's the smallest amount out of focus, throw little lessons like that, seeing it on that big screen,
Yeah.
really that really makes things hit home. Um, so the chance that those film students get to do that is amazing in real life.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to talk about some movies. In one of the film school darling film, everybody studies it and talks about it.
Yeah.
And I'm reading these books about script writing, as you know very well. We'll talk about that
Mhm.
later, maybe a little bit.
Maybe.
Um, Chinatown
Yes.
is like, I had never heard of it. And when I'm out until the pandemic, I was out in LA every month, and I go
Mhm.
to my friends' houses. Everybody's got like the poster of Chinatown framed in their house.
Yeah, it's
Um,
Chinatown, Terry.
I know, and I should know this, but I'm from Texas, so we're not really into that. But this is a Jack Nicholson, Faye Dunaway movie from the '70s, and I watched it
Yes.
a couple months ago, and just to study it. It was
Mhm.
pretty amazing. The writing is very. You can see all the elements from that. But like, what do you teach film students when you watch a movie like Chinatown? What do they learn from that?
Well, Chinatown came about kind of in the modernist era, like before postmodernism, which is basically the era we're in right now. And it's really a breakdown of a lot of the conventions of genres that had been there before. Like, you take the hard-boiled detective, and then you just like injure the hell out of him. You like, slice his nose open and you
Right.
injure him, which is completely going against film noir. So you're basically making a lot of things ambiguous. You're taking, all these genres, and you're basically starting to explode them. And that's really one of the things that made Chinatown so revolutionary, is that it did break all these genre rules. So it wasn't your typical, like, hard-boiled detective film anymore.
Right.
Suddenly these guys became very, very mortal very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole nose thing, like I watched it and I'm like, yeah, he cut his nose or whatever. But that then when you read about it in these books that I'm reading about it,
Mhm.
script writing, the nose thing was a big deal. What happened to Jack
Yeah,
Nicholson? It's a movie about, for those who don't know, it's about like the 1930s. There was these water wars in LA, and
they're still going
uh,
on.
they're still going on. Water in the canals and everything. Water in Southern California is a big deal because it's so dry. So it's a
Mhm.
fictional story. But anyway, it was interesting to watch that. And when it used to be, everybody's a film expert because we all like movies and we like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and whatever.
Mhm.
But now when I watch them, I really watch them for like, how's the camera motion going, how's the lighting, um, and you watch, especially like the TV shows, the Netflix TV series their quality is just unbelievable.
Yes,
And
yes, they
of
are.
writing and filmmaking, and you'll watch this scene, and now I'm thinking, God, somebody had to do the set design. That took them forever to put
Mm-hmm.
everything where they need to do. You got
Yep.
to get the costumes and the makeup just to get the right
Mm-hmm.
lighting at the right time. There was a
Yes.
scene in Nomadland. They were like walking with the person. It's all handheld, and the sun was right there, and you get the lens flare. And I remember thinking, like, that is such a simple 5-second scene that nobody's going to notice, and that
Mm-hmm.
took days of planning and meticulous thought.
No, not
Weeks
no,
or
no, that didn't.
no.
No, Nomadland was run and gun.
Well, maybe not
Nomadland.
Nomadland. I mean, scenes in movies take time to set up, though, I think.
Normally they do, but Nomadland is kind of an exception to that. I mean, yes, the film was planned out, it was scouted, but there's very little artificial lighting in that film. It
Right.
was shot by an incredibly small crew. I mean, in some ways, it reminds me of an IMAX film because our crews are intentionally very, very small. I mean,
Couple people.
not the bigger ones get up to like 16 people. I
Right.
mean, we're not bringing an army by any stretch because we just couldn't. I mean, you can't go off into, the jungles of Madagascar with 100 people. The lemurs will run for the hills and disappear on you.
Right.
It just doesn't work. Um, but with Nomadland, I mean, they kept an intentionally small crew,
Right.
and they were able to run very light, and they were able to just react to what was around them and work
Right.
very, very quickly because they were shooting with a lot of available light. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why I was really so impressed with the cinematography and the acting, especially since they weren't using professional actors in many, many roles. They
Yeah.
got incredible results. I mean, Chloe Zhao did a great job with, what she was doing, and it had a very real feel to me. I mean, I do
Oh
know
yeah.
people who live in their vans,
Right.
and everything about that film felt real. Uplifting, not necessarily, no, but
I was
it
ready to
felt
jump off a
real.
bridge after watching it. I'm like, oh, but
Okay, I
but
didn't
it was
find it
really well
that
done.
bad.
It was
Yeah.
really well done. It
Yeah,
was
it was. But, generally speaking, yeah, you do want to go and have, proper lighting and work everything. But then again, you do run into these magic moments when you're filmmaking
right.
where you're just like, oh my God, this incredible thing is happening. And just like, Tony Myers told you, it's like, look, if a space alien shows up at the
Right.
window of the ISS and it's not on your shot list, film it anyway. We'll
Right.
we'll figure it out.
That was my favorite Tony quote. I think she
Yeah.
told all of her astronauts that.
Yeah, and she's absolutely right. And then
Right.
when you've got a film like Shawshank, like there's a scene just like you're talking about. So after Morgan Freeman, Red is out of prison and he's in the field and he's found a little box under the rock in the field. You see him walking back and he's going through this field, and all of a sudden all these grasshoppers start just jumping along. No, there was no line item in the budget for grasshoppers. Somebody on set just spotted this and said, go have Morgan walk through the field over here right now. Look at where the sun is. Let's just go do it. And they did. And it's this beautiful moment that just gives you this amazing feel, but it wasn't planned. It was
Right.
just there. And somebody had the presence of mind to be like, okay, turn the camera and shoot that way right now.
Right.
And they got a great shot out of it. And I think that just goes to something that, IMAX, really brings about, is that no matter how much you plan, you get these moments that, planning, gets you in position for, even if you're not aware of them. And you really need to take advantage and just, when you see the moment happening, go for it.
Yeah. Well, in One More Orbit, that was we set a world record. We took off from the Kennedy Space Center, flew over the North Pole, South Pole, and
Mm-hmm.
landed back there. And it was like a world speed record.
Mm-hmm.
And so One More Orbit is a documentary about this. And I'm comparing orbiting the Earth in an airplane with orbiting the Earth in a spaceship.
Mm-hmm.
And we had teams. We had 3 refueling stops and the takeoff location, and so we had basically 5 crews around the world filming this 2-day event. And my direction to each of the local cinematographers was just film what you can get. I mean, these are the scenes that we want, but keep your mind open. And like Dan Green in Kazakhstan got the most amazing, beautiful footage of the local area in Kazakhstan.
Yep.
Bill Bennett in South America got the most amazing interview with basically his handler, the fixer. he was the most amazing guy. The interview with him is in the movie. It wasn't planned at all. Nick Sadler interviewed this lady in Mauritius who had been the Mauritian TV announcer during the Apollo landing. And he was in the control tower one day filming airplanes. And he was like, hey, does anybody know this lady? Yeah. And he found this lady just through random, that curiosity. Let's go film this scene. Now, our movie wasn't Shawshank Redemption. It wasn't a scripted drama. But those guys taught me that lesson that, man, you got to just have a camera with you and be ready to film at any time. And some of the best scenes in One More Orbit were just unplanned.
Yep.
Which is pretty cool.
Honestly, that's the way that pretty much all filmmaking works. And you get story after story, when you start talking to filmmakers about these moments in film that you find out later were completely unplanned. They just came completely out of left field.
Right.
Somebody mumbled their lines, somebody just saw grasshoppers over their left shoulder,
right,
whatever it may be. And they become like these magical moments that we remember.
So what are the best films? Like, what films do you use for your example? You told me I had never seen Shawshank Redemption. The 90s, I was busy flying F-16s around the world. I actually missed out on a lot. I'm trying to catch up on my 90s movies. I think one of the worst movies I ever saw, I want to talk about that here in a second, is from the 90s. But, the Shawshank Redemption is amazing. And I didn't know this. It's like the top rated movie. It's
the most beloved film of all time, like in poll after poll. Yeah.
That's amazing. It was an incredible story. I'm so glad you told me about it.
Oh,
so
yeah.
What are movies that you use as examples?
Well, for me, I'm generally focusing on IMAX, obviously, so that's a little different. So we talk about Everest, which is a real seminal film. I'm lucky that I get to take my students to IMAX headquarters, which is not far away from USC, and they get to see some of the original IMAX films. They get to see North of Superior, which was basically funded by the Canadian government back in the early 70s, and then we had to see
Tony
To
Myers
Fly.
movie.
Yes, she worked on that. Yes, she did.
There's a shot in our movie, A Beautiful Planet, from that flying across Lake Superior. Anyway,
yeah, and that was shot in 1971.
Right, on film.
And
by the way, so let's talk about film. I love film. I grew up with film camera. You had to put the thing in and manually adapt it. And now everything's digital, except not quite, right? Doesn't Christopher Nolan shoot on film?
You still have a few filmmakers that like film, and they shoot on it for a few reasons. I mean, this is one of the things I talk to my students about, is that, the question always comes up. It's like, should I shoot film? Should I shoot digital? Because every so often Quentin Tarantino or Nolan or somebody comes out and is like, I'm going to shoot film. And film is great. It just feels different than digital. Neither one is inherently better than the other. Both are going to achieve exactly what you're looking for, which is to get an image captured so that you can rebroadcast it somehow for people to watch. So both are successful that way. But film is going to feel inherently a little bit softer. Some people would say romantic, which is an opinion. And then the colors are going to behave differently based on the emulsion and the development process. With digital, you're going to get a bit more sharpness. And to wander off into being technical just for a second, it's because the way they capture them is physically different. With digital, you've got a tiny little chip with very organized little square pixels that are picking up everything, and the red, the green, and the blue are not evenly sampled in digital, generally speaking. With film, red, green, and blue are even, but they're all these irregular little chemical flakes that are on a piece of celluloid. So they're inherently a little bit softer, and they're going to feel different. So for a DP who really knows what they're doing, they're going to pick up on that right away, and they're going to know that this is going to feel a certain way versus that. So that's one way to look at it. The other way is shooting film is very expensive now. I mean, Kodak only runs film so often in this day and age because digital is just so much cheaper to work with and just to film more and more of. Now, when I say cheaper, that's partially true because the hard drive storage space you need to buy to keep and protect all that digital footage is also quite expensive. But directors and DPs tend to shoot a lot more when it's digital because they think that they can. And that is a good and a bad thing in some ways. But they do feel different. But because digital costs less, that can be the way to go. So, on a feature budget, if you can save $1 or $2 million, well, that $1 or $2 million buys a lot of different things. From, you can get an actor who has a higher price tag. You can, put more money into production design. You can put more money into advertising. So it's sort of a balance. And the answer is, what's the right choice for this film? It's not a global like film is better or digital is better. It's a what is right for this project you're working on.
Right. But when you film it on film, on wet film, like a physical
Mm-hmm.
piece of film, you shoot it on the film, you process it, and then you scan
Yes.
it digitally, and then you
Yes.
you actually edit the movie from the scan of the film.
Mostly, yeah. I mean, that's the way things mainly work now. But I mean, you can go back. I mean, I was one of the last classes to go through USC where I actually like shot stuff for my cinematography class, and then we edited the film like, with basically scissors and tape.
So you'd cut the film,
Oh
put
yeah.
them together, and tape them
Oh yeah.
together.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd like to apologize to some of my roommates who heard me working deep into the night sometime in my bedroom, being like, click,
Right.
click, because that was definitely going on with my student
So
films.
it was literally the cutting room floor. Now it's like Control C,
Yeah,
but back then it was actually
yeah, and now we have
cutting
to
it.
explain to our kids why it's called a bin in Avid. It's because we used to have a bin with hooks on it, and a very soft cloth sack on wheels that we push around the room with all of your short ends in there, which was all of your cuttings of the film that you'd be
Right.
splicing together. And they're like, oh, like they don't understand that.
Right.
On the first day of class each year, I asked my students, how many of you have put like proper film into a still camera? And we're now below 30% that have ever done that in their life.
Wow. So the modern filmmakers have never put a cartridge of film in a camera.
No, they haven't.
Yeah.
But they've also grown up with editing software since they were like
Right.
8.
Right. So they're good with that.
Mm-hmm.
That's just technology. I mean, how many of us have ever cranked a car engine or, wash by hand or, technology changes, which is a good thing.
They
Um,
have more filmmaking capability in their iPhone
yeah.
than we had in the 90s.
You can make, where's my iPhone? You can make a pretty good movie with one of these things. I
Yeah, you
mean,
can.
it's amazing.
Oh yeah.
And so anyway, it's amazing the technology. So there's different elements, obviously, of a film team. Just like on this, it was amazing to me working on this first movie that I did, how similar it was to a space team, because everybody had, there's different roles.
Mm-hmm.
The director is kind of like the commander, the flight director, if you will, and um, it I have learned very much the importance of having these different people to do their jobs right.
Oh
Like
yeah.
movies aren't made, especially documentaries, without a great editor. I mean, the editor actually makes the movie. They're the ones that put the movie
Mm-hmm.
together. You have to have a producer. The producer that I learned was more like a program manager. They're the one that makes everything happen, like gets the
Mm-hmm.
studio set up, gets the actors on board, gets the film crew ready. They're the ones that kind of organize everything. And
Yeah.
in my mind, the producer was like, and I didn't know this stuff before a couple of years ago. I didn't know. I thought producers and directors and executive producers were all the same.
No.
The executive producer is kind of like either they put the money in
Mm-hmm.
or they're the force behind the movie or maybe a creator or something like that. There's different
Mm-hmm.
kinds of executive producers, right?
Yeah, there are.
Some of
Yeah,
them have nothing to do with the
can
movie. Some of them are pretty
executive producer
involved.
can be a little bit nebulous.
Right.
It's normally they're involved with the financing and the green lighting of the project. Sometimes an executive producer doesn't bring any money. They just have the relationship with the studio to get somebody to say yes.
Right.
So, and that's a big
That's
deal.
important. Right.
Yeah, it's huge.
So the executive producers like help the movie to get made.
Yes.
The producer actually makes the details happen.
Yeah, and then you have like the line producer who is the person who's in charge of like your day-to-day budget and
Right.
who's like keeping an eye on like, okay, how much have we spent, what's the cash flow going to look like, because
Right.
that's another thing. I mean, back when most of the IMAX teams that I've worked with, they're still the original filmmakers, like the original people who came out of like the 70s and 80s when this was
Right.
becoming a medium. And the stories that I've heard from them have been that like when Grand Canyon was made, they got all the money up front. They got like, just here's your pile of cash, go bring us back a film. And
Right.
that would never happen today. Now the funding requirements, there's a lot more corporate, a lot more governance involved.
Right.
So you have to plan out, okay, how much you're going to be spending week by week. We're going to do all this because the creative funding parts start coming in. It's like you may get some of the money up front, but then you put some of it into a money market, so you're earning interest on it while you're waiting for it to be spent. And there are all these financial games that get played to get the films made. And frankly, it's this invisible dance that's going on behind the scenes, even from many of the filmmakers, just to keep the ship moving.
Right. It's the process that goes into that, and then you have the filmmakers or the cinematographers.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of didn't really know what this was until I worked on A Beautiful Planet, but they're they shoot the film. The director doesn't actually shoot the film. He's got, camera operators, and the DP,
Yep.
the director of
Mm-hmm.
photography is the person in charge of, are we going to use ARRI? Are we going to use Red? Are we going to use Canon? They
Sure.
pick out those cameras.
Mm-hmm.
Are they is it going to look 1950s blue, or is it going to be warm, or they do all those details. And I kind of thought I was a camera nerd, and I got to help make Beautiful Planet, and I was working with these Canon cinema cameras,
Mm-hmm.
so I thought I knew something. And then when we did One More Orbit, I hired James Nyhouse, who had been our
Mm-hmm.
our director of photography for The Beautiful Planet. So we have our directors meeting with the cinematographers. So I tell everybody, hey, this is the story, this is what we want, and I hand it over to James, and he just started spouting off all these super detailed, I don't even know what he was saying. He just started talking camera talk to these
Uh-huh.
other camera talk people, and of course they all want to out camera talk each other. And I was like, oh my god. And in that moment I realized that I'm not a cinematographer. I think I could be a director, but I
Mm-hmm.
was like, yeah, that's that's varsity level right there, the stuff that they were talking about.
It is. And that's also like a portion of the filmmaking, because there's so many different little genres of it. When you're able to get to that point, it's really great that you can focus in and dial it in. But so
Right.
much of the filmmaking that I've dealt with in the nonfiction world, whether it be IMAX or otherwise, yeah, with IMAX you have to be very precise. But in other nonfiction projects, it's you've got one camera and there's a lot of run and gun, so you basically choose your settings early and that's what you're on. In James's case, what he was talking about was making all the cameras that were going to be pre-positioned around the world and on the plane for you guys.
Right.
You needed everything to match. So they were trying to dial in color temperature. They were trying to
Yes.
dial in all this stuff.
That was a nightmare. We were hoping to have, we had one company that said they were going to sponsor us. They were excited, and then we got ghosted at the last minute. And so
Yeah,
I
that's
think
not uncommon.
yeah, we had 12 different camera brands and camera types, which was a nightmare in editing and then in editing you have to do color correction and make it look nice. That was a real nightmare. At least with film, if everybody's
Mhm.
using Kodak, Ektachrome, whatever, it's the same. It's going to look the same. And with digital, an RA is different than a Red, is different than a Sony, is different than a
Yeah,
Canon.
but
So
you
it,
have to remember,
yeah,
even with the film, it's also down to how you expose it too. So it's not just that you're on film. You still color correct before you finish. You're just
right.
doing your color correction with actual lights and in the in on wet film. So you're actually doing your proper 3 light process to get that final color timing.
Yeah.
With
I,
some of the colorists I've worked with, I know this is going to sound insane to you considering what you went through on One More Orbit, but there can be 18 to 35 different fully color timed versions of a film released in the United States for like a Marvel picture.
oh, really?
Yeah, because they have to be optimized for each different type of theater because the projection technology is different. So IMAX actually goes through and recolor times the entire film for IMAX, even if it's not shot for IMAX. And then Dolby Vision is going to look different than XD Cinema, which is going to look different than how it looks on a Christie projector versus a Barco projector versus film versus all these different small different projection formats that are now propagating throughout the world. So there can be quite a few different versions released, and the DP has to go through and sit through and personally approve each one before it gets released.
Wow.
So, and the thing is that with the timing on it, they're literally running around, usually Los Angeles, could be New York, but they're bouncing from, like color timing house to color timing house, being like, okay, I'm at IMAX, in the morning, then I'm over at company 3 in the afternoon, and then I have to go over here. And then, the last like 6 weeks before release is just like color timing the final edit, over and over again and trying to get them to feel exactly the right way.
Yeah. Therapy was our editing house, and I spent months there. It was
Mm-hmm.
amazing. Those guys were awesome. They were the best. And I think James Nyhouse was in once because he was the director of photography. So that was kind of his job, but he wasn't in LA that much. So I ended up doing a lot of it. But that was a big thing. I never knew until I made a movie how important
Mm-hmm.
that post-production is. I mean, you did post-production, so you know
Oh
what
yeah.
this is. But I mean, and the joke was always like, just film it, we'll fix it in post. Well, that's a
Remove that from your vocabulary. Don't
yeah,
do that.
that is a big a
Yeah,
big job.
it is. Although there is something else I wanted to just jump back on when you're talking about all the different roles. One of the most important things that I remember learning in film school is that each film gets basically retold 3 times before it gets released. So, in the whole process, which I know you've been discovering with this narrative project that we've been working on, when the film is told 3 different times by generally 3 different people. Sometimes if it's Chloe Zhao, it's the same person, but that's not common. You write the film and you write one film, and then you direct the film, which could turn it into something a bit different. And then the person with the final say is actually the editor,
The
who
editor,
comes
yeah.
in and actually takes now what has been taken from the script and then directed and physically exists. And that has to become what the final project is. So there are actually 3 people who, in some way, are really controlling the story of each film.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a very interesting thing, that I learned early on. And I know you're learning right now, is that, each film is told 3 times.
Yeah, that's amazing. I hadn't thought of it that way because so you and I sat down that Sunday afternoon 2 years ago at Nick Sadler's house in the Hollywood Hills, and we wrote. I saved the yellow legal notepad that we wrote. We wrote One More Orbit
Yep.
out, and
Mm-hmm.
and then I directed it, and really each of the DPs in each location directed their own little part of the movie. And
Mm-hmm.
then and the editors really made the movie. So that's interesting. And even but that was a documentary, but even for narratives they get changed.
Yeah. But I mean, when you're going into a documentary, generally you want to have some at least outline that you think you know where the story is. I mean, by all means, that could not be the final story. When you're on a doc, the
Right.
story is going to take you in a lot of different directions.
Right.
But the more you have like a general sense of where you're starting from, you at least then have a plan and you can at least communicate that to people.
Right. So you got the big people. Obviously the director is kind of like the conductor, the producer, the executive producers, the cinematographer, the editor. Those are all really big. The production, art, direct, design, and those guys that make
Mm-hmm.
the sets and make it look pretty. But the one that is hitting me now, just how important it is. And you know what? The show that really hit home for me uh, was Breaking Bad, and that is the writer and just how well written Breaking Bad was. I mean, that
Mm-hmm.
show, the writing in that show blew me away. And until I got into film, like if I would have watched it a couple years ago, I would have thought, oh, that's good. What I thought about movies were like, who's the actor? There's Tom Cruise, there's Brad Pitt, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and what happened. Those were cool spaceship scenes or whatever. But now, the writing in it is so amazing, and I've
Yeah.
read these books about it, and you have to have a character arc. The character has to change over time, and each scene something big needs to happen. And so I'm noticing these little details, and I think Breaking Bad is one of the best examples I've ever seen of writing.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway,
Yeah.
the writer is like super important, and you and I are obviously writing this project. We'll save that for another podcast someday.
Yes.
But it's fun and it's cool, and it's hard. It's not easy, and it takes time.
It
Takes
is.
me time
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. Well, it takes everybody time. I mean, screenwriting is a difficult task because you're basically trying to pull a story out of thin air and put it onto paper. I mean, it's it's just as hard as writing a novel, except you get fewer words and fewer pages to work with.
Right. So you gave me the technique to write it all out. I bought myself a corkboard. And so
Mm-hmm.
for each episode, I have these different colored, I wrote out what the thing's going to be. And then I've got the big elements, and I have this corkboard full of colored
Mm-hmm.
index cards, which is pretty cool. And it was super helpful because, I wrote this big, long, 10 episode thing. And then I went back and rewrote it. But then I sat there and I just stared at the corkboard one night for hours, and it was so helpful. Like I need to add a scene in here. I need to add a scene in there. And that visually, that helped me to kind of see how the whole story is going. But
Mm-hmm.
the writing is something that I just never thought about it. I was just like a fan. I just like movies. I didn't ever think about it. And it's impressive. And you don't just write it in Microsoft Word. There's a whole screenplay format that's like a different,
Yeah.
it's like learning French or something. It's a different language.
It yeah, I mean, it's not quite a different language. I mean, we're still speaking English, at least on this project, but yeah, I mean, there are conventions, and you just it's a different way to think about organizing how you're telling a story.
So with all these different roles, like
Mm-hmm.
what's a really well-written movie?
Oh
I've
God.
got one in mind.
I mean, there are a lot of different films that are
Like what
well
stands
written.
out for writing? The one that I've got in my brain is Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, Pulp Fiction is well written, but it also comes off as well written because it's edited well, also because
Huh.
what you see on screen is not entirely what was written. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
part of the story of Pulp Fiction, very famously, is that you know Tarantino wrote the film with a linear timeline, and it wasn't working emotionally. So I believe he reached out to Francis Ford Coppola, unless I'm getting that wrong, and Francis looked at it and was like,
Yeah.
just like reorganized a few things, be like, okay, now I made the emotional loop make sense, or the emotional arc make sense, and we're just going to tell this out of order. And that's part of what made that film so revolutionary. I mean, yes, it was about style, and
The
it was about a very
dialogue was pretty
specific.
impressive.
Yes, the dialogue was impressive, but there was that major reorganization in the editing that made the film inherently become Pulp Fiction. I mean,
Right.
everything else is great, but if that whole, you know, emotional arc of the film didn't work, it wouldn't have won Cannes. It wouldn't be this great cultural moment that we had in the early 90s. And that, just becomes this like major like moment in cinema if that didn't happen.
Right.
For me, a film that's incredibly well written is Shawshank, because when you look
Yeah.
at it, you're like, that is a really great film because it has its theme. It knows exactly what it's talking about, and it doesn't hit you over the head with it. It tells, it tells an entire story about hope without ever really mentioning the word very often.
Right.
And you get to go through this entire journey, and you have this really emotional screenplay that happens. And yeah, it's based off of a Stephen King work, but remember, it's only a short story that this is based off of. It's not based off of a novel. So Frank
Right.
Darabont went in and created this incredible script. By the way, he started off as a set dresser. So that's a
Wow.
very interesting place to start, because he didn't start as a writer. He started as the guy who made sure that like all the plates were still in the right place when you were moving the camera angles around. And he tells this incredible story that just really grabs you and knows exactly how to, you know, emotionally connect with you to get this story told. And to me, that's, one example of an incredibly well written film.
It
And
was amazing.
yeah, I mean, there are tons and tons of other really well written scripts out there. I mean, a lot of people talk about Citizen Kane because it's,
Mm-hmm.
incredibly, seminal for that time period. But then you also get films like Rebecca, which is a Hitchcock film, which was a bit outside of Hitchcock's normal suspense genre to an extent. One of the characters doesn't even have a name. Like the primary character is never named. Nobody mentions her name. Nobody says her name. She's just like the girl. And
What is she? And so in the screenplay, she's the girl.
I forget what they actually refer to her how they refer to her in the screenplay, but she doesn't actually have an
Right.
on-screen name.
Right.
So, I mean, that is in there. And then because you're in the middle of the Hays Code, Hitchcock was actually very, kind of, he liked to push boundaries a lot,
Yeah.
like a lot, for the time.
he
So
was
he has
good.
all these like coded messages throughout the entire film also. So
Right.
he's telling this incredible story without telling the story.
Right.
And the same thing happened with Billy Wilder in A Place in the Sun, which was, again, a great film that's incredibly well written, but frankly, I think is even more impressive when you realize that it's not able to really talk about the central issue that it wants to talk about. Everything had to be in code and told visually just with like hand gestures. And even though that's not dialogue, it's still an incredible script.
So one of the mantras that I've learned is show, don't tell.
Yes.
So film is a visual medium, is what you hear all the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you don't want to just have dialogue. Like if you're doing a play is tell, don't show. There's going to be actors on the stage talking about what's happening and what they're thinking and so on. But in film, you'd rather show somebody being stressed out or joyful. Or in The Americans, Stan Beeman, the FBI agent, Noah Emmerich, he always twitches. If something's going on, his face twitches. And that's like
Mm-hmm.
this acting skill that he has. And you could write a paragraph about what's going on, or you just watch his face and he twitches and you know that he's
Mm-hmm.
thinking something. And so there's a movie called The Saint with Val Kilmer. I just watched it. I've been watching all these 90s movies. And
Yeah.
I think that's on the Mount Rushmore of worst ever movies. And there's a scene where he's sitting there and he's finally figured out what happened to the girl or whatever. And he just is talking out loud for him. It's like his thoughts, only he's talking them. He's like, oh, she must have thought this, and she was doing this because she thought this. But it's like the worst example of, they weren't doing show, don't tell. It was
Yeah.
just him talking out loud. So that stood out to me.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, it's like, why don't you just put up a text card?
A
Like,
little
let's go
thought
back to the
bubble
old
of,
silent film days and put a text card on the screen. It'll be easier.
Exactly. So there's the writing. There's also the filming, the cinematography. So what movies stand out to you? Yeah, I got to meet Chivo Lubeski, and he won the Oscar 3 years in a row for
Mm-hmm.
Gravity and Birdman and Revenant. So I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that type of skill is I love that stuff. And for people who don't know, that's the ASC. So you're in the PGA, right?
Yeah.
The Producers Guild, the Production Guild of America, as I misspoke.
Yeah. Producers Guild. Yes.
So
Yeah.
ASC, yeah,
Yeah. We're interesting because we're not a bargaining unit. We're just like we're more of like a trade group than a bargaining guild, like most of the other Hollywood guilds are.
right. But ASC, American Society of Cinematographers, and again, these are the people that are in charge of the cameras, and they shoot a film.
Yes.
And they have annual awards. I just did their, unfortunately it was Zoom. I normally go out and live, and it's just awesome. You're just watching all this like eye candy, these great, amazing scenes that people shot. And
Mm-hmm.
so what movies stand out to you as exceptionally well filmed?
Oh God.
Shot?
God, there are so many. Um, Sorry, you've got me on the spot here. I mean, most of the work by Roger Deakins is
Yes. I
just
was just thinking
exceptional.
1917. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 1917 is and obviously an achievement, but then you also go to Sicario, and he filmed so much of that with low light and in fairly difficult conditions, and he films a lot of it in silhouette also, which I found to be a really interesting choice, and it works
What does that
really
mean?
well.
What does that mean?
So basically, he filmed their when towards the end, when they start going into the tunnels and they're outside, it's dusk and you're filming just like the silhouettes, like you can see the outline of somebody, but you can't see any detail.
Right.
And that's a
Okay.
very conscious
Yeah.
choice.
Right.
And it looked spectacular.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible. I mean, obviously it's kind of easy to go into like the nature film realm and start talking about that. About how many amazing films there are, in the IMAX world, because the cinematography has to be so good. I mean, Everest was shot incredibly well by Greg McGillivray back in the day.
Well,
there are many other
1917, is that called a one shot, like the Birdman?
So that's not it's designed to feel like it's one continuous take. It's not,
right? Of
but
course,
it feels like it.
Right.
They're
I'm kind of fascinated by those. I love that. Like Birdman was amazing.
Yep.
The James Bond movie at the beginning of Spectre, when they're in Mexico City.
Mm-hmm.
There's like that opening James Bond scene is like 10 minutes of it probably took them a month to film, but it looks like it's just
Probably.
one continuous.
Yeah.
Those, I love those. I want to make a one shot movie. That's my goal.
That be careful what you ask for. That is incredibly difficult. Make sure you have budget because yeah,
Right.
I mean the amount of time that they had to rehearse the entire crew to do that film
Right.
is insane. And you're doing a war movie on top of it, so that's already challenging.
Right.
But when you go back, I mean, there are a lot of really well shot films, but one that stands out in my brain right now is All the President's Men back from the 70s that, you know, Redford did. Um, that's a
Not
great
Nixon.
example. It's a great example of modernist filmmaking. And Howard Wexler did, I believe that was Wexler, did a really amazing job, you know, in just framing all of these interior scenes really well. And then you can kind of take that forward a little bit and go to like the original Superman film as well. And it's like Superman 2, again, shot beautifully. I mean, just really well done. And then, of course, Close Encounters, because, you know, that's just a seminal film that like I loved growing up. But I also didn't understand all the reasons why I loved it when I was growing up. And through the process of film school, you learn so much about just like how that film came together, and you know, and you really get to see a lot of the genius in Spielberg and his relationships with his DP and his editor that just made that film so good.
Well, in the book I'm reading, Brian McKee has a book called Story. It's like the how to write a script that everybody uses this book. And he's talking about use less words, don't word too much when you're writing the description. And there's a scene in Close Encounters where there's a car chase through the crazy driving. He runs into some fences and stuff. And the writing in that script that Spielberg wrote was Bob swaps paint with a fence or something. And that, like, it was a one line description for an entire scene of a car chase. Swapping paint with the fence. I love those kind of things. But when you go to the ASC Awards nowadays, and like everything is just beautiful. The cinematography quality is through the roof. For here's one, a modern series is The Crown.
Yeah.
And the the visuals on that are amazing. They're just absolutely beautiful. The lighting, the colors, it's gorgeous. I really love that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, The Crown is gorgeous. Bridgerton was also shot beautifully. I think those are the two most popular series on Netflix this year. I just read somewhere. But then you've also got, you know, lots and lots of nature documentaries that come out. And you know, my hat's off to BBC for being able, and Discovery for funding these projects where they're like, okay, here's a team of cinematographers. We're going to drop you in the wilderness for a year.
Right.
Go find your shot and take all the time you need.
Right.
And that's so rare that somebody will, you know, approve that.
The BBC has one out called Earth in Full Color or something like that. I haven't watched it. This has been my year to catch up on Pulp Fiction and Shawshank Redemption. And I watched Breaking Bad for the first time, and I'm finishing up Narcos right now. So I'm like catching up on all the old stuff.
Yeah. I've gotten sucked down the murder show hole lately, which has been surprisingly fun to watch. I mean, like last night, like I binged like Sasquatch, like Murder by Sasquatch.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy. But then there've been some other like I've always been partial to like documentaries and nonfiction. It's really just sort of my jam.
Right.
And man, I watched this film on Netflix that I just like happened on over the holidays. It's called Operation Odessa. And you're like, what the hell is this? It's about the craziest story I've ever heard about this Russian mobster who comes over to America, just a low level guy, not like some like big brain or anything, calls himself Tarzan, opens a strip club in Miami, gets involved in the drug trade. And one thing leads to another. and he's calling his friends back in Russia. And this is around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
So he starts making these deals with the Cali cartel to like deliver heavy lift helicopters. And then the whole thing culminates with him brokering the deal for a diesel submarine.
Yeah, with or without torpedoes.
Yeah. And it's
You're the third person who's told me about that in the last day. I need to watch this. I need to
it
watch this.
is it is absolutely bonkers. It is a
Can you
bonkers.
believe
Yeah.
Tiger King? It was over a
Yes.
year ago. That was over a year ago. It seems like
Yeah.
5,000 years ago.
Yeah. I've actually gotten to work with, the filmmakers on that for another project that I did. Hilariously, they work at a turtle sanctuary, like out in Ventura County.
Wow.
That's where their facility is. It's beautiful. They're also the nicest people who are absolutely nothing like,
The
that whole group
characters.
of people that they were
Right.
interacting with.
That was crazy. But there's been
Yeah.
some great documentaries. The Social Dilemma was amazing.
I haven't seen that yet. I know I need to, but I just haven't gotten there.
It's one of the biggest threats to humanity and the American democracy, for sure. It's definitely worth watching. There was one about the Russian doping scandal, maybe a couple years, came out 2 years ago or something.
Yeah, friends of mine worked on that. Yeah.
And it's like, these
Icarus.
documentary filmmakers, they just immerse themselves in a story. Well, free solo. Like you just have to immerse yourself into the story and film it. And
we screened that for the IMAX club at USC and had Jimmy and Alex come out for it.
Well, I mean, there's so many good films out there, but so we're talking about the different roles, the cinematographer, director, blah, blah, blah. But the one role that everybody knows and they think is everything about a movie is the actor, right? The actor or the actress. That's like, it's a Tom Cruise movies or whatever. It's a Natalie Portman movie, but that skill, and I haven't really acted that much. I did like a few small parts in small films. I was like the evil general. My buddy was making this dystopian movie, and I was the evil general that was sending all the poor kids to war while the rich kids got to stay home and not go to war. So it was just in these very minor, almost nothing parts. It's hard to act, to try and say lines like you're not reading a line, like you're being a real person. That is a difficult skill.
It is.
And I had a chance 15 years ago, I was on the set of Star Trek Enterprise. It was the last ever episode of the TV show Star Trek Enterprise. They're at the Paramount Studios. And Scott Bakula was the captain of the Enterprise, and he had talked to my friend while he was in space. And so we went out there. We actually got a cameo. So I joke, like, for about 10 years, if you Googled me, the thing that came up about me was I was on Star Trek. It wasn't that I was an astronaut. It was like that I had 3 seconds and no lines on a Star Trek TV show. So, and we got to know Scott, amazing guy. We were talking about Little League. Our boys were playing baseball, and then he would go on set, and it was like everybody watched him and all the eyes were on him, and he had this commanding presence, and he was the captain of the Enterprise. And it was like, holy shit, man, this guy, he is a star. And it was the last one. So all the former Star Trek actors from like Star Trek Next Generation, it was like a reunion. And these guys are special. They really are talented. Not that they're more valuable or we should worship them. We shouldn't. They're just human beings. But as actors, they are really, it really impacted me. There's a reason why they're stars, and that's not an easy thing, to say the least.
No, it isn't. I mean, unfortunately, there's part of our culture that gives actors sort of like a bad rep for a lot of different reasons.
Right.
But yeah, a talented actor can make or break a film. And, that presence on film can either convey what the director wants to do or not. So casting is really, truly important. And frankly, one of the roles in the whole film system that doesn't get enough attention is the casting director.
I was about to bring that up. This is where I was going.
Yeah. It's like, being able to put together a group of people that really match each character is challenging. And, you have to have this like just encyclopedia of people in your
Hmm.
brain, not just famous people, but people who are incredibly talented who may not have had the opportunity for exposure yet, that you need to just be aware of and be like, oh, they're perfect for that role, and you go find them.
Right. That is amazingly, and I appreciate that now more. In fact, as we're writing, I've got my list of characters and I've got my list of who I want to play
Mm-hmm.
different characters. And um, anyway, that's an aspect of filmmaking I never thought of before until, I got to know these people and I've started to think through it. And it seems seamless, like it just happens, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it is. I think the casting director does a lot of work. um they say that writers should write their script as actor bait, like you should know what actor you want and like write your script so that hopefully that actor will do it. I don't know if that works or not, but
Yes and no. I mean, writing it that way is makes it easier for you to get funding, that's for sure. But um, that's not always true. I mean, sometimes you know you want to write a script that you design for no-name actors because you also have to have the actor disappear into the role. I mean, there's some actors that are talented, but they become so well known for one part that you're always going to see them as that
right,
part, and you
right.
have to be careful about that.
Yeah, like if you're Luke Skywalker, it's going to be hard to not be Luke
Yeah,
Skywalker. He's done other things. I mean, Mark Hamill has been
yeah,
diverse,
and
but
he's actually been very smart about going into voice acting and doing so many voiceover roles
right,
because he can disappear, behind an animated character very easily, which
right.
is good. And
Yeah,
now he's become, his career has been able to flourish because he's not just that. I mean, Harrison Ford has taken on multiple iconic roles and
yeah,
made it work, which is rare. I mean, he's both
yeah,
Luke Skywalker and Indiana Jones and
right,
Jack Ryan.
right.
So he's able to pull that off.
Yeah,
But then there
he
are other people who I won't name that, you see them on screen, you're like, oh, it's that person. And they're effectively playing themselves now.
right. Yeah, that's one of the downfalls. Now, if you ask a young actor, "Hey, you're going to have this amazing role. You're going to make a ton of money. You're going to be a global icon. Do you want to do it?" 100% of them would raise their hand, and then maybe 50 years later, they're like, "I did that movie when I was 25, and then I never did anything else." And
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's a mixed blessing, but Hollywood's a pretty fickle industry. I think
It can
fame is
be.
fleeting.
Yeah. And honestly, the worst part of that is if you're a child actor and you get really known for a part, and then
Yeah,
that's what you're known for the rest of your life,
right.
and you can't get rid of it.
It's hard. It's a tough thing to do.
Yeah.
So,
I
so
mean, it's also a lot of pressure to put on a kid. I mean, poor Macaulay
yeah,
Culkin. I mean, he's known as, the kid from
right,
Home Alone for, even to this day.
right. Yeah, a lot of those John Hughes, like in the 80s, there was all those cool movies that I loved, and
Mm-hmm.
Molly Ringwald is Pretty in Pink, and
Yep.
Ferris Bueller, and it's hard to get out of that. Although it's hard to feel sorry for them because they made all this money and they got famous, but they got a whole life to live. So
Yeah, but you got to be careful because the money doesn't necessarily last. I mean, sure, you get a big score
right,
right away, but no 16-year-old is like, wow, I need to go get some like investment bonds.
buy
I
my
need to like,
401k, right,
I mean, some of them before, I don't even think 401k existed for some of those poor kids.
right,
They're not thinking like, hey, if I buy an income property, they're not thinking this way.
right, right. Yeah,
So
it's interesting.
yeah, and residuals are great, but they peter out over time, and they're unless you have a lot of them coming in, they're not enough to live on.
Right. So one of the roles that we haven't talked about, and I don't even know if this is a real thing. You told me a story one time about censorship. You were teaching a class about how
No,
to
no, I was
censor
not.
out.
No. Okay.
It's at
I
least
took a
10% true.
censorship class. I was not teaching the censorship class. So no, USC has a very famous class on censorship that meets at 9 in the morning on Tuesdays, and it goes over the entire history of censorship. And you learn all sorts of things about censorship, and a lot of it's really interesting. You learn like where the industry started, how it was actually kind of tawdry at the beginning in some respects, and then the Hayes Code came in because you had all the the moralism of like the earliest 20th century, and and that's how you wound up with like the former postmaster general like regulating the film industry, which was weird. and then how people would try and get around that. And then, getting into the modernist era and the fall of the Hays Code, you started having the ability to show nudity and sex on TV. I mean, well, on film, actually. And that became really interesting. I mean, one of the famous aspects of that class is they used to project Deep Throat on film at 9 a.m. And that's just not the time of day to be watching that.
Who was your you had a guest lecture?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, he endowed the class. I mean, Hugh Hefner was a big part of the class.
I
mean, he would come in and talk, once. I mean,
right.
He wasn't like the primary professor, but
right.
He was fascinating. I mean, when I took the class in, I think, the fall of '99, he was really fascinating because just like a huge part of, censorship in America throughout the mid 20th century, he was involved in.
Right.
Generally fighting against it. And a lot of people don't really
imagine.
recognize his role in that we have a lot of freedoms that we do now because of the fights that he had. People just remember him from Playboy, and
right.
he actually did a lot more than that.
Well, I'm working, a friend of mine is a producer, and she's trying to raise some money for a film. So I'm trying to help her raise the money. But there's a lot of F-bombs in this film. And I'm like, hey, this is going to be an R-rated movie. And there's a money implication to being R-rated, right? There's limit. So, and she said, yeah, we talked about it. We know, blah, blah, blah. So it's interesting that the economics of the movie gets all the way back to the script and how many F-bombs you have, or, is there a topless scene or not, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that can actually drive the bottom line of the film.
Oh, yeah. And the thing is that it evolves over time also. I mean, you have to remember back in the 80s, it felt like, there had to be at least one topless scene in a film for it to make any money whatsoever.
Right. And so R-rated is one side, but also G-rated is also kind of a kiss of death.
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of times my kids, we'd be watching these kids movies and all of a sudden they'd cuss or something. I'm like, why are they doing that? That was not necessary for my 10-year-old, but they did that so they could get a PG rating, which would boost sales. And
yep.
So they just say these, it's like, doesn't make sense. Why, come on, there's, but it was just interesting that you have to manage your censorship based on how much income you want to make on the other side of the film.
Yeah, or just to get your film released at all, because the theaters who sign on to the MPAA agreement generally aren't supposed to be showing NC-17 films at all. So you get into interesting situations with filmmakers that want to push that envelope, like South Park, Bigger, Longer, Uncut. They put in, and Team America, they put in intentional bait scenes for the MPAA board to cut. And what was fascinating is that it wasn't always the bait scene that they took objection to. And I won't mention what it is because we don't want to give your podcast an R rating, but they put in some very foul things on purpose so that they would have things intentionally to cut to then get out what they really wanted to. And that's not always the way that worked. But
that's interesting.
But this really comes back to another thing. And this is in many ways why, cable and streaming has become like the place to go for really interesting content. And I'm not even really going to say edgy content at this point. I mean, I think our society has moved to a place where we can have open, frank discussions about, sex and sexuality and drug use and, other societal problems openly. And we don't have to like code it in things. But without having the issue of something having the R rating and limiting the box office, it really helps because you can have, longer form storytelling and you can tell more adult stories. And I don't mean that in a porn way. I just mean that in like a, let's talk about a real issue kind of way.
Right.
And you can do that on cable because you don't have broadcast standards. You don't have that like R rating where we're not going to let the 17-year-olds in, so we won't make money and all that stuff.
Right. Have you seen I think it's called Bad Trip?
No.
Okay. It's this film. It's kind of like Impractical Jokers, that reality show with those crazy New York guys that they just go and they film them doing some crazy thing that shocks everybody. It's like a reality show. And it's the most original. And I started to watch it. I thought this is going to be the stupidest movie. It's like a 13-year-old boy humor movie. And like in the first scene, the guy's working at a car wash. He's got the vacuum, and all of a sudden the vacuum grabs him by his jumpsuit, and it sucks his entire clothes off, and he's standing there naked.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a guy like, what's going on? And anyway, the whole movie is just these reality shock scenes, and they go
Mm-hmm.
on a trip from Miami to New York, and there's hardly any plot. And I've never laughed so hard. I was laughing out of my seat. You mentioned drug use. They steal their sister's car because she's in
Mm-hmm.
jail, and it's a pink Cadillac, and it's called Bad Bitch. The license plate is Bad Bitch, and they're
God.
driving Bad Bitch across the country.
Uh-huh.
And the guy's like, "Oh, I need some breath mints," and "Oh, your sister has breath mints here," so they take the breath mint, and it's some kind of drug, and they have the drug scene is like the funniest scene I have ever seen. It was like this crazy. You've got to be kidding me! Like Nomadland. It must have been filmed on an iPhone, just with, and it was so creative. I guess why I'm saying this is the filmmaking was extremely creative. A movie that I was not expecting. The budget must have been extremely low, to say the least, but it had me cracking up. I probably shouldn't admit that I was laughing to it because it's not politically correct humor, but it was pretty funny.
People laugh to whatever makes them really, really funny at that moment.
There's a reason why The Office is so popular. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not because it's in today's woke culture. There's a reason why people love it so much. And
Yeah,
sometimes it's okay to just be human and laugh at ourselves. We need more of that.
that is true. But I have an interesting relationship with The Office because so many people refer to me as Michael Scott when they first meet me. I'm like, no, 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 no. No, 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 no.
That's what she said.
Yeah,
So
that's happened. Yeah, no, I'm Matt Scott, not Michael Scott.
from your name, I thought you meant from your personality.
No, no, for my name. No, I'm
I
like, no,
didn't
no,
think of
no.
that.
It's like, no, 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 I'm no,
Oh my God, that is funny.
no,
So
no.
tell me about, this has been in the news. Tell me about the Cinerama Dome.
Okay, so Cineramadome is a very famous theater, but it's also part of a theater chain which is extremely popular in Los Angeles called the ArcLight. And the ArcLight are really the theaters for, um, you know, film enthusiasts and industry people to go to for a number of different reasons. Number one, they program m- more interesting films, so they're not just programming, your giant tentpole superhero films. They're
Marvel,
programming
right?
they do program them, but they also program, a lot of the art house stuff. That's where a lot of the industry screenings take place. So even when it's not like a bought out industry screening, they'll do, you'll see a lot of industry people just going to the movies on their own time there, and you'll run into people. And then, yeah, they do premieres, but it's just a really nice theater designed for people who care about the movies. And they also take care of their audience in many respects. I mean, yes, the popcorn was expensive, just like anywhere else. And they had little restaurants in there that, again, cost a bit, but they also had a full
Right.
bar, which was great. Um, but the biggest thing is that you got assigned seats, so you didn't have to queue up for an hour and a half to
Right.
get a decent seat. And
Right.
you also, they also like would police the theaters. So if somebody was talking or misbehaving in the theater, they would throw your ass out. I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
boom. And that was wonderful because, like, I tried going to like a normal civilian theater, we'll say, that was up by my house, that wasn't really meant for industry people, it was meant for kids. And this one other theater chain now has this thing where they send an usher to walk in front of the screen with a lighted baton 3 times during every movie to check the emergency exits to make sure nobody's like sneaking in. And I'm like, give me my money back.
Oh my
It's like, you're
gosh.
worried about losing
Yeah.
money by people sneaking in. I want my money back because you're interrupting my movie.
Oh my
So
God.
stop this.
That's awful.
It is.
Yeah.
It's terrible. Like, I'm like, these theaters were so good. I mean, they weren't even like the ones where you had like the Barca Lounger and like food service during the
Right.
movie.
Right.
It's not that. It was just like, it's a theater,
Right.
mainly stadium seating, but really good line of sight on the screen. The chairs were comfortable, and the projection was really top notch. They actually like cared about it and made sure that
Right.
things were right. And they'd even have the usher come and like introduce the film in front of every screening,
Oh,
which was
wow. That's cool.
wonderful. So you
Yeah.
really got this like, feeling of like being in a film community when you were there. I mean, for people who weren't in LA, I mean, the Alamo Draft House would be kind of like the closest analogy that would be sort of like on a national level. And because of COVID, they couldn't operate for a year.
Yeah.
And, that's not a shock because, cramming a whole bunch of people into a small room during a pandemic is probably a terrible idea.
Right.
So the problem is that they these theater complexes that they had built, and they were multiplexes, were normally in a number of the shopping malls that were around here. And even though they were sort of the anchor of those malls, now that most department stores have gone away, some of the malls just demanded all of the back rent, and there was no way they were going to do that. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of dollars
Right.
in back rent that they couldn't do. So they're just like, we see no way out, and they're just folding. And we're
Right.
hoping that, just the film community here is hoping that some people with some good deep pockets step up to basically buy the chain and re-envision and, just revitalize it.
Right.
Because it was like the place to go. Like, I
Right.
don't want to go to another theater. Like, I'll go to the Chinese because it's a special theater. It's actually not the best theater from an acoustic standpoint. It's an IMAX theater now, and IMAX did everything in their power to make that room as perfect as they could, but it just wasn't designed acoustically for that format.
Right.
So there are really only like 3 or 4 theaters I want to go to now.
Yeah.
Now that that's gone.
Yeah, the industry struggle. I really hope it comes back, because there's something special about going to see a movie. There's nothing better than sitting there in the 20th Century Fox. That opening noise at the beginning of a Star Wars movie is like the coolest thing. Here comes Star Wars.
Yeah.
It's so exciting.
Yes.
And I hope we don't lose that experience. That's something that we need to keep.
Yeah, I mean, the Cinerama Dome was also special in that it was designed for Cinerama, which was a special format that existed mainly in the late 50s, 60s.
Oh, wow.
I mean, Cinerama can be its own discussion. I actually talk about it in my class because it's like an early, like, giant screen format. But I mean, we know we won't lose that theater. It'll eventually reopen because it's a historic landmark at this point.
Right.
But yeah, finding like really high quality theaters is going to be hard. And frankly, that's just a function of the way the industry has changed over the years, and that we have sort of like devolved in some ways down to like mainly tentpole films.
Right.
More interesting, like mid-level adult films have been kind of pushed off to like art house theaters.
Yeah.
But then also theaters in general are struggling because they're up against a completely random existential threat to their existence, and that's video games. I mean, you have so many fewer kids going to movies now because they've got whatever the latest video game is that it's going to keep them occupied for weeks.
Video games are like movies. They have actors, they have stories. It's not just playing aliens anymore, whatever, Missile Command. They are storytelling.
Yeah.
And
oh yeah. In fact, that's actually a division of the film school now, is that we have a basically interactive and video game division, and it's focused on storytelling through video games.
Yeah, it's a different world. I hope we need to keep films. So let's end on this. Favorite films of all time. I'll list off mine, and then I'll let you list off yours. Interstellar, I love because it's a story about a father and daughter. Plus, it's a cool space movie. The Right Stuff, because it's the right stuff. It's Top Gun, because it's Top Gun. Back to the Future. A lot of the John Hughes movies from the 80s were cool. That's when I grew up. T2, because it was so Terminator 2, because it was so original and terrifying, and it was like Jim Cameron could see the future. It was really awesome. And Alien was the best. Man, that was so good. That was such a great film. Because you didn't really see I didn't like Aliens because they're just an army of aliens, but I liked Alien because it was like hidden. So anyway, those are some of my top films.
For me, we've got let's see, Fifth Element. Absolutely love it. I know it's not considered the greatest film of all time, but it's just fun. I just enjoyed that. I actually got shit for that in film school, actually, but I don't care. I love it. Shawshank Redemption, because how can you not love it? Black Panther, honestly. I like the storytelling. I also like what it took to make that film because the world building in that is spectacular. The
Hmm.
fact they were able to build this entire concept of Pan-Africanism, like I know what an achievement that was, and just so inspiring that they could pull that off. Um, let's see, Lawrence of Arabia, gotta like that. Love All the President's Men. Love Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
I actually like Indiana Jones above Star Wars, which I know is controversial in the USC film school since Star Wars sort of built it, but there you go.
Right.
Um, and then going back, yeah, I like Chinatown. I like Rosemary's Baby. I really enjoyed Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. That film is just, it's just fun. Like I really
Yes.
like enjoyed it. Um,
I really like that.
yeah. And then there are other films that, you just go back and you're like, you can watch it over and over again. Like I like War Games, and
Hmm.
it's in some ways like a silly early 80s film, but
Yeah.
I'm from Seattle. It takes place there, so I have that connection to it. And I just really enjoyed that. And I thought it was well done, and I can watch that movie over and over and over again. Um, Kind of like Barney to a small kid back in the day. And yeah, I mean, I think we can leave that list there because the list just keeps going on and on. There's so many
As a
films that
film
I've
school
enjoyed over the
professor.
years.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, hey man, that's a amazing list, and thanks for talking. This was a long discussion. We could talk for hours and hours about how to make movies and
Oh my God,
what
yes.
what what movies are good and bad. And the beauty of this is that it's art, and so beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Some
Hmm.
people like it, some people hate it, and that's okay. If you
Yeah.
make a movie that everybody likes, it's probably not a great movie. It may,
Hmm.
you didn't push any boundaries, and so
Yeah.
um,
Actually, let me add two more films to that really quick.
okay.
Rush, that Ron Howard did, and then Spy Game.
Oh wow,
So I don't
okay.
know if you've seen them, but there are certain films that come out every year that are just like I really like. They don't necessarily have great box office, but they're just really well told films. And
Hmm.
Rush to me is an achievement because it made me care about Formula One, and I just don't. Like
Hmm.
inherently, I do not care about car racing, but I actually cared in that film. And then you're like, wow, that's something to get me to do that.
The Niki
Um,
Lauda film.
yes,
Yeah, it
exactly.
was really good. I'm
Yeah, it
watching
was
Netflix has
excellent.
a Formula One series. I'm watching it right now. Like a
Okay.
documentary series. I want to
Yeah.
drive Formula One cars now. This is making me crazy. I want to go drive race cars.
Yeah. But then Spy Game is also just an incredibly well told film. And
I
then
think I saw
I,
that.
oh, and the last film before we go that I will mention because it ties right back to IMAX is a film that was inadvertently perfect for IMAX, and that's Mad Max Fury Road. And I know this is going to sound strange, but the way that George Miller directed it, and John Seal, who was kind enough to come out and speak to the kids at USC back when it was like the night before the Oscars a few years ago, he did this incredible thing where when he was filming it, they knew they were going to be cutting it at this frenetic pace. And by the way, there was no script. It was, I forget how many thousand storyboards just tacked up on a wall. That was the script. There was no script. It was storyboards, period. They went and shot it, and basically to make the editing pace work, they wound up center framing all of the shots so that your eye wouldn't be roaming all over the screen trying to find things, just like you would cut an IMAX film. So when you take that film and you blow it up to IMAX scale, it actually works really, really well. And I now use that film in my class because it's a great example of knowing what you're supposed to be doing for one medium, but making it work for another that's going to be critical to your financial success. And I recognize that that was done completely accidentally, but it was done so well, I can't help but teach it.
That's amazing. So Mad Max was shot without a script, just
Yes.
storyboards. That's
Yes. And it was
unbelievable.
shot perfectly for IMAX too, which is again just an
Wow.
accident that was amazing.
I'd rather be lucky than good, as we say in the Air Force.
Yeah, but that came about because you had many, many very veteran filmmakers working on it. I mean, George Miller obviously is, a director who's absolutely on his game. And then John Seale's an Academy Award winning cinematographer, and
Right.
he's been on his game for years. So, putting them together, you had this really high chance of success, which is great.
Amazing. Well, and then you can't forget One More Orbit on the list of all-time greats.
I have the patch on my jacket. So
It,
yes,
that's right. We had patches for that. It's a
you
fun
did.
film. I love watching it. It
It
was
is.
it was a really fun, cool project.
It is. I wish I could have been on the plane with you, because that sounds
Yeah,
like it was an amazing adventure up there.
it was we had a lot of fun. We all still stay in touch. We got our WhatsApp group. We'll text each other. So well, anyway, Matt, hey, thank you so much for coming on. This is a lot. We've been talking for a long time, but we could talk
Thanks
for
for having me.
hours. Yeah, this is cool. So thanks for checking in from Death Valley, and we will talk soon. If you guys like the podcast, subscribe and rate us at Down to Earth with Terry Virts, and we'll see you again next week.